This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Page 27 of the Johnson report, Mr. Johnson states that an issues management note was sent from CSIS to the then Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair, his deputy minister, as well as Minister Blair's chief of staff in May of 2021, warning that Member of Parliament Michael Chong, another MP, and their family in China were being targeted by the Beijing regime. Is Mr. Johnson's report accurate in that regard?
Madam Chair, the report is indeed accurate.
And Mr. Johnson further states at page 27 that IMU was not seen by the minister as chief of staff or the deputy minister because they did not have access at the time to what he called the top secret network email. Is Mr. Johnson correct in that regard?
Madam Chair, that's the understanding I have from what Mr. Johnson said after having an interview or discussion with Minister Blair. So that is the understanding I have through the report.
Well, do you have any knowledge or information that Minister Blair had knowledge of that IMU at the time?
Madam Chair, I did not have any specific discussion with Minister Blair about that specific note.
Okay. Well, Minister Blair has a very different version of events. He said, first of all, that there is no email account. So that is precisely contrary to what Mr. Johnson states in his report. How can what Mr. Johnson concludes be reconciled with what Mr. Blair told this committee on June the 1st?
Madam Chair, my understanding of how the information flows from an agency to a minister is that this is sent to the department. In this case, Department of Public Safety is the department supporting the minister, and that would be one of the most usual way that information reaches a minister on a topic like this. So it will be unusual for the minister to receive classified information directly through electronic means.
Okay, but it was sent by electronic means, is that right?
Yes, the way that we CSIS would be communicating this information to the department for onward transmission to the minister is by secure electronic means.
Okay, and that's presumably why, for example, his deputy minister would have been sent the IMU in addition to the minister and his chief of staff. But again, Minister Blair says there's no email account, and he further stated that whatever is brought to his attention is determined by you, the director of CSIS. That's exactly what he said. Is that accurate?
Madam Chair, I think it is true that a lot of the information that would be exchanged between CSIS and the minister will come directly from me or from one of my senior officials in different organized briefings. But we also have, I think it's important to note here that we have a lot of exchange of documentation. And the exchange of documentation would be coming, as I mentioned earlier, through mostly electronic means to the department to be able to be printed and made available to the minister. So these would be the two most common ways that we would be exchanging information.
Minister Blair went further. He said you, as the director of CSIS, would decide what to brief him on, that he would wait for you to advise him. And secondly, he said, quote, the director determined that this was not information the minister needed to know, so I was never notified of the existence of that intelligence, nor was it ever shared with me. That's what he said on June 1st. Did you determine that this was information, that information being the IMU, that the minister did not need to know?
Madam Chair, in this specific case, there's two ways that the information would be shared. One is when we have intelligence reports. Those intelligence reports are written and shared with the department to be curated for the minister. So it will depend on the department's decision from time to time to see what the minister will have access to. But it's also important that when we see we have something of high importance, we have instituted this process called information management note that would be shared to bring attention to something more specifically. And that was the purpose of this note. It was to bring it to the attention of those people who were distant to. I would like to add, Madam Chair, that it's clear that Minister Blair, in his testimony, has mentioned that he has not seen that note, and I have no reason to doubt that.
But he said that you determined that that information was something he didn't need to know, and from what I understand from what the answer you just provided, that's not the case. You didn't make that decision.
Madam Chair, that would be an accurate description, and I think the fact that we did an issue management note speaks to the notion that we wanted to highlight the information.
Oh, boy.
Thank you.
Following up on my line of questioning and that presented by Mr. Berthold, I want to make sure that I fully understand what you have said with respect to the IMUs. As I understand it, there are intelligence reports that are produced in the thousands each year, and then there are IMUs in which on average 2 to 3 are produced a week, and IMUs are produced because it is, quote, and I'm quoting you, when we see something of high importance. Is that correct? Do I understand you correctly?
That would be accurate, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you for that. And when you see something of high importance by way of an IMU product that is addressed to a minister, it is because you would want the minister to see that IMU. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, the IMU is sometimes directed at the minister, but also sometimes will be directed at other officials as well in the government.
But when it is addressed to a minister, it would
Yes.
be because you'd want the minister to see it, right?
That would be accurate, Madam Chair.
And I just want to go back to Minister Blair's testimony. He said, and I think it's just important to put it on record, on June 1st, he said, in specific response to the issue of the IMU concerning MP Chong, quote, the director determined that this was not information the minister needed to know, close quote. He further went on to say, in this case, they, being you, made an operational decision that was not required, closed quote. And he then added that he was not provided this because of your supposed operational decision that he characterized as one that was quite appropriately made. How do you explain the minister's testimony? Because it's not just a case of him not seeing it. He's talking about an operational decision that was made by you that he even went on to say was quite appropriately made in not informing him.
I think, Madam Chair, what is clear is that the process did not work. I think myself and other witnesses in front of your committee have spoken about the fact that the way the intelligence is being ingested by different parties at ministerial level, but also at all levels of officials, the system is often not maybe adequate, and there is a need to make a significant improvement. And I would venture to say that this is one such example that where the information was meant to be seen by the minister and was not. And I think it's a problem that we need to fix. It's a problem that is important. because people of CSIS and other intelligence organizations do take risk to collect this intelligence, and we need to make sure that it is available to the right people.
And I certainly agree with you, Mr. Vino, through you, Madam Chair, that this is something the minister should have seen, and I have a lot of questions for the minister as to why he would make such statements that fly in the face of what you have said, making very specific claims about certain operational decisions that he claims were quite appropriately made to keep him in the dark on a matter that you said is prepared in the way of a report when we see something of high importance, and I can see why it was of high importance given what we were dealing with, which was MP Chong and another MP and their families being a target of the Beijing regime. We know that after the IMU was prepared, that there was a CSIS memo of July 2021 that revealed that MP Chong and I believe other MPs were being targeted by Beijing. Jody Thomas, the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, when she appeared on June the 1st, said that that memo from CSIS was sent to the PCO, as well as the Deputy Ministers of Foreign Affairs, Public Safety, and National Defense. Was that memo sent to anyone else, to your knowledge?
Madam Chair, for sure those individuals, I don't remember if there were other individuals, but that would have been the most senior people that would have been the recipients of this.
And very briefly, Madam Chair, was that memo an IMU document or product?
Madam Chair, if I recall correctly, this memo was what we call an intelligence assessment. So not raw information, raw intelligence, but an analysis of the intelligence available on a specific topic.
I've got just a few questions to help me understand the difference between an intelligence assessment report, which I think, if I understand correctly, comes from the Secretariat and was sent, if I understood Mr. Rigby's testimony correctly, this information was collated and sent to the National Security Advisor, Public Safety, Foreign Affairs, and National Defense. And what's the difference between that assessment and an IMU or the issues management note? What's the difference between those two?
So, Madam Chair, I think it's an important point given the fact that there's been a lot of references to different intelligence processes or documents. Intelligence starts from collecting information. So you have initial information that will be what we call a raw intelligence product.
You got data.
We have data, we have information. It could be coming from different, partners. So that information, is used by intelligence analysts to create intelligence. So you have one report that would speak to something specific we know. A compilation of these reports, those building blocks, plus any other information, open source information from our allies, information from other intelligence services, is then used by our specialists, our experts, and that's what they will produce, what we call an intelligence assessment, to try to paint a picture of a situation. Okay. And I think that was the document that was referred to earlier of July. The IMU note is what it, so IMU, so issues management note, is a tool that, given the fact that there's so much information, there's so much moving parts in our system, we have put in place this tool to draw the attention of different people, sometimes ministers, but often the rest of the bureaucracy, of something that we want to draw our attention to. So it may not be containing any intelligence, it may just be something that is happening that we want to be mindful of.
That's very, very clear. So you talked about this issues management note, and it's been the topic of discussion, at least in the questions that we've had. The Minister of Public Safety, the former Minister of Public Safety, was here. We understand that, and has made some claims that seem to be contradictory to not only what David Johnson has said in his report, but what we've heard. So I'm trying to flesh this out, because what's at stake here is the safety and security of a member of Parliament. So When was this IMU, or when were these issues management notes, when was this process established, roughly? Could you tell this committee, like, this is not something new, right?
So thank you for the question, Madam Chair. We actually established the issue management notes probably back in 2015, about that period of time. And the intention was because we have a very robust process in sharing intelligence, and as Mr. Vigneault has indicated, we have what we call a raw intelligence product, then we have an intelligence assessment product, but those go to a very different audience. Those go to all of the individuals within the S&I community. So the IMU note was then created because we wanted to make sure we could inform on a specific event at a specific time.
You know, it's so you've got these notes are well established. This is not something new. Nobody, if they've been around since 2015, nobody can reasonably claim that this is a new process or I fail to understand how this process works. Is there a higher way to signal importance? Because from my perspective, I'm seeing this as a red flag on an email. When we send emails to each other, we mark priority or importance on emails. So this, to me, seems like a red flag on an email from a layman term perspective. But I can also send a read receipt. So if somebody opens the document, it tells me that they've actually read it. Are you aware? Do you have any signal to indicate whether or not the information that was sent in the IMU in question was actually opened and read? It seems to, like, basic email service offers this. Does our intelligence sharing have a similar type of guarantee or certainty that the information important enough to be flagged is actually read?
So, Madam Chair, I think this is a very important point the member is raising, because it's not that what I think is clear is that if we have put in place a process to flag, and here in this specific case, the minister was very clear he did not get the information. So that means the process that was in place, the support he was receiving from us or from public safety did not, in this case, work. Yes, there were the conditions of the pandemic, which I think should not be overlooked. But more fundamentally than that, if it's something of importance, if it does not work for the minister, and again, you know, a minister was very clear with that, it is incumbent upon us, ourselves, his office, and the Department of Public Safety, to what is the right tool to put in place to make sure that, you know, the critical information is seen by the minister. And I think this is one of the key lesson that we need to put in place, is to have this ability to adapt our processes when it's not working.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Vigneault, David Johnson repeatedly claimed in his report that with regards to interference in the 2021 election, foreign interference, that, quote, misinformation could not be traced to a state-sponsored source, closed quote. This is in stark contrast to what Mr. O'Toole informed the House, namely that CSIS briefed him that, quote, my party, several members of my caucus, and me were targets of misinformation and voter suppression orchestrated by Beijing before and during the 2021 election, close quote. So, how can Mr. Johnson's conclusions be reconciled with what CSIS informed Mr. O'Toole?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll be trying to straddle the line of the classified information here. The ministerial directive is quite clear that CSIS is to share all information that we have in our disposal, and so that was the case with in question. I mentioned earlier that sometimes we have information that needs to be corroborated, that needs to be vetted, and rigorous practice. Without going to very specific details, I can say that there is some information that was shared in that briefing that, you know, may have been part of that category. But it was important to respect the directive that, you know, all information be shared. I think in his testimony, the independent special rapporteur has also mentioned that, you know, that there is maybe other information that, you know, that he would need to look at. And the focus of the work was clearly on the election, on the 2019 and 2021 election. But that doesn't mean that it's to look at all of the intelligence available through CSIS or through agencies. And I think this is one of these situation that we're faced now with, is the words of the MP in the House versus what was shared by CSIS versus what was provided to the reporter.
For that. Now, quite a gap, quite a contrast, really, between what Mr. Johnson concluded, that he couldn't find evidence that that interference was state-sponsored, with what Mr. O'Toole was told by CSIS, which was that Beijing orchestrated a campaign that included misinformation using, among other things, state social media accounts. That was also contained in a rapid response mechanism report, but frankly, Mr. Johnson should have seen and couldn't explain how he hadn't seen it when he concluded, as he did, that he couldn't find evidence that there were that interference was tied to the Beijing regime. But Mr. Johnson, which you also alluded to, stated in answer that he based his conclusions on the intelligence that he had. Are you suggesting that Mr. Johnson wasn't provided all relevant evidence and intelligence, or do you know?
Madam Chair, I think that what is clear is that the focus of the work was on the integrity of the election for 2019 and 2021. So I think that the work and the report clearly focuses on that. The discrepancy that the member points out to, it's a very valid point. And as I mentioned, that information that has been shared under the ministerial directive was to be all information, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's information that we would necessarily have assessed as something that with the right level of certainty about the action, but that information was shared with despite that was not necessarily information that had been previously put into intelligence reports, because it was still being developed. We still needed to confirm some of that information. But I totally understand the confusion that exists here, and I think this is something that, with access to all of it, will be available.
Thank you for that, and you are quite right. It pertained to Mr. Johnson's report, and what was the subject of his investigation was specifically the 2019 and 2021 elections, and the information that was shared with Mr. O'Toole pertains directly to the 21 election, and Mr. Johnson already had his report in translation by the time he saw fit to interview Mr. O'Toole, and then he basically fails to address it and comes evidently to completely erroneous conclusions. Thank you, Madam Chair.